Good day, everyone. So happy that you guys are tuning into another video that we are doing for the Faceplant event series. And today I'm speaking with somebody I really admire. As a plant collector, I and most of you probably know him as DocBlock, the creator of beautiful hybrid anthuriums that we see on Instagram and elsewhere, and that are so very coveted. But actually, DocBlock is an actual doctor. And today, I would like to speak to him and welcome him here in this series as a trusted professional physician-botanist. And I have to look at my notes now because your background does warrant a formal intro. And you're a subject matter expert. And as such, you've combined your extensive clinical healthcare experience with your internationally recognized horticultural expertise. And what I want to speak to you about today is your work in the field of aroid plants. And more interestingly, now that I know about it, your research in the medical use of plants and specifically cannabis. So thank you so much for joining me here, Dr. Jeff Block from Florida in the US. So happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Tanya.
Great. So let's dive right into our first question. And of course, to me as a plant collector, it's always very interesting to know how other people have come to the passion of working with nature. Now, I'm just a little hobbyist, but you are an internationally acclaimed horticulturalist. You are not just the owner of Block Botanical Gardens, but you have other ventures that you're working on. We can see that in the logos next to you. You have a business called Nurturing Nature, which again sounds a lot like we're dealing with plants here. But yes, I'm interested to hear what drew you to plants in the first place, and that can be aroids or any others. So, yeah.
Well, it's maybe not as much an individual plant or family as family, my family. Many of us have had parents, grandparents who you sort of look at, learn from, and pass down, not secrets, but just a little, in this case, family wisdom about how to grow things. And as a child, you observe, and then if it's something you like yourself, you do it. But I attribute most of what I learned about plants to my Nana, my grandmother, who moved to Miami back right after World War II. And I wasn't even living here then. I'm from the Northeast part of the United States, but my parents moved me down here partly to be where the weather was warm, plants plentiful, and where Nana was. And so starting as a 14-year-old, I came down and started to observe more. By the way, no 14-year-old wants to move. I don't care where you live. It's a horrible time to pick somebody up and transfer. But the fact is, when I look back at it for one sentinel point in my life, it was that as that 14-year-old came down to be closer to Nana. And what was she doing most every day, especially during the coldest winter days where I came from? She's outside basking in sunlight and beautiful weather in Miami playing with plants. They weren't necessarily aroids. They included aroids. I found a fascination with plants that had ornamental flowers. So orchids were real big in the days. Bromeliads, like orchids, grow up in trees as what we call epiphytes. And they also had flowers that lasted a long time. So here I wasn't only looking at a cut flower. I mean, when I saw a cut flower of an orchid growing up as a kid, maybe it was as a corsage or what they would give someone on prom night, to show off. So plants included bromeliads, of course, aroids, orchids. I was coming down here and I saw palm trees for the first time, really looking at them, around in the landscape. So there was something else tropical. But a few years after, I went off to college, university, and I went back to Emory University, which is in Atlanta. These are mid-Atlantic states, Georgia being there, where it actually gets cold in the winter, and you do have an observable spring. What was most notably different, though, where I moved to in what we call subtropics, was that we really didn't have a traditional winter or summer. We had a rainy season that carried most of the summer and a non-rainy season, which is when in other parts of the country, at least here, it was colder. So thinking about it in terms of the wealth that fresh water, rain, and heat brings to plant growth is really how we started to look at, and what I learned from my grandmother, how to mitigate the extremes of too much rain or not enough. What do you do to keep the plants going? Because most of the plants she introduced me to were what she was fascinated by when she came here herself, which were subtropical plants. And you really in those days couldn't find many things subtropical growing up north until she saw a coal-heated greenhouse from the DuPont estate that later became Longwood Gardens in the United States, a notable botanical garden. And she was smitten. So she moved down here, and most of what I learned started from her. But once I went away to school, Emory University is where I learned chemistry. And that's where I started to pull certain things together. And without carrying on too much about where academics meet plants, I will tell you that a sentinel moment for me is when I saw what are called molecules, not what you can see in the plant, of course, visually, but what they're really made of. And I saw a molecule of chlorophyll. That's the plant's energy. Those are the particular cells called chloroplasts that plants use to turn the sunlight into their own energy. And as soon as I saw that, it started to say, okay, it just looks like a lot of letters and lines like most molecules are depicted. But then I went to medical school a few years later and I saw a molecule of what's called hemoglobin. That's the body's blood. And that's the way that we as animals transfer the energy of oxygen that's carried by that blood to our cells. Those two molecules, hemoglobin and chlorophyll, are remarkably similar. And so when you think about how different we are from plants, not so necessarily molecularly or necessarily biochemically, that's where the two started to make more sense to me, because it told me that maybe really deep inside, or evolutionary wise, because remember, these would have started from one ancestral molecule billions of years ago, that eventually we know now by what they looked like were remarkably similar and most likely come from that same root structure. To me, that was fascinating, and it combined horticulture essentially with medicine.
Wow, that is a super interesting fact. Maybe we can find, actually, I think there's some information about that on your website, nurturingnature.com. Maybe I can link that in the show notes, because I think I saw a slide with that. Speaking of medical school, could you elaborate on the medicinal aspects of plants? And I know that's a very broad question, but where do you see like that overlap between your passion for horticulture and the medicinal aspects of plants?
Well, it's a great question, because it goes back again historically, but it's not just my history. It's probably the history of humans sharing information about plants as they apply to health, wellness, whether that's as a food or as a medicine. In ancient times, before there were physicians, let's just say that a tribe of nomads might have had one person in their tribe who was the noted healer, the person they trusted with knowing the secrets lots of times concerning plants. Which plants do you eat? Which ones don't you? What do you do if you have a wound? Those secrets, which were really not secrets because they weren't archived only for special people, but they were the responsibility of certain learned people, even in ancient prehistoric times. And if in fact then a given healer of their tribe wasn't able to sustain the given plant, in other words, weren't good as a grower to keep the plant alive, they would have failed at their craft. And then they wouldn't be regarded as a good healer or a plantsman or woman. So I found that the historical importance of that was likely the things that really drive me today to want to really share or teach more at this stage of my career. I went through the collector stages like most people do when they're younger and fascinated with plants. But now the role is really more of a custodial role because I do grow certain things that are rare or more challenging to grow than others. And so sustaining those plants in the big picture of life is probably more important as the custodial role we have when we're here for these little short blips of time. But to pass along things that are not secrets, but basic information, how to sustain things going forward is a really important thing that I try to impart to my children or people who want to listen to this podcast so that they too can succeed in it, because that will be their role in years to come.
Wow. I was just thinking, if crops such as wheat, etc., were the beginnings of agriculture, could the jobs that healers had, could those be like the beginnings of modern gardening, if you will?
In a very real sense, yes. I think that's a great thing because we went from being nomadic to agricultural, certainly through some combinations of them. Certain people would stay back and take care of the plant crops. Others would go out as hunter-gatherers and bring things back. So as humans evolved and civilizations evolved, they all had to deal with the consequence of where they're living, because obviously growing things in one environment could be very different than another. One of the
Yeah.
things that fascinates me about being here where I am in the subtropics is that if you look at what's called the biomass, where are most of the plants in the world situated? They're in these tropical and subtropical areas.
Mhm.
So again, even alluding to issues such as global warming, those rainforest areas, I guess the largest and perhaps most important for the planet would be in the Amazon.
Mhm.
That really, in a very real sense, understanding what plants do. They bring in the CO2 and they give off oxygen. We need the oxygen, the plants need the CO2. And so those areas of the world are really the planet's lungs. They're breathing. They're keeping the planet going. You can't breathe, nothing else matters. In real life, I'm an anesthesiologist. And I say that
Wow.
frequently because we're regarded as experts of airways to keep someone protected and breathing. But again, when you can't breathe, nothing else matters. And you can make that same analogy to the planet.
Right, and that's where your molecule comparison comes full circle, with the Amazon being the lungs. And yeah, I like that. Awesome. What I'd really like to touch upon, because, and obviously we've spoken about this before, but I've gotten so much fascinating information for you that I really want to share that with our audience, is you have a focus in your work on the medicinal use of cannabis. And of course, with legislation changing, etc., we know that people use it for various reasons other than getting high, if we want to put it like that. But you've also been deeply involved in shaping that regulatory landscape, at least in the US. What do you find so fascinating about cannabinoids, I think you call them? Yeah, you
Well,
will know
the
more.
word cannabinoids or
No.
endocannabinoids. What I find really more fascinating than cannabis itself is that plants have long identified, well, I say long, the last 50 to 75 years in medicine have been most noteworthy, perhaps, for understanding that we're all basically hardwired through receptors.
Mhm.
These are the structures we have in us that respond to chemicals that then cause something to happen within our physiology or the way we work, our body works. So there are lots of different receptor systems, hundreds as a matter of fact, but some of those receptor systems were discovered because of looking at the way plants interact with us. For instance, endorphins, which you've heard
Mhm.
a lot about, ORPH, that's the same word structure in the word morphine, because endorphins were originally appreciated as being a receptor system because of the functions of where morphine comes from. The opium poppy, it's a flower.
Mhm.
Then you have nicotinic receptors. Doesn't have to do with nicotine that the way you figure it's from cigarettes or tobacco. But again, some of the body functions that we've learned about of receptors come from studying the impact of plants' chemicals on us. Other ones then would include perhaps the most recently identified one is probably capsaicin. Capsaicin is what is in chili pepper. And that's identified a system of receptors called endocannabinoids. Well, there are three principal receptor systems responsible for how we as humans interpret pain. And this is where my fellowship was dedicated to in anesthesia, not so much on plants, but understanding pain. And those three would be endorphins, we just said have come from the opium poppy as far as the knowledge and appreciation of it. But in fact, we've had those systems in us far longer than the opium poppy's been around. The flower evolved and found a way to interact with, in this case, animals through that receptor system. We don't have those receptors because there's a flower, but the plants are ingenious in a sense. They find ways to interact with their environment and surroundings. So the opium poppy interacts with human endorphin receptors. Endocannabinoid receptors in the chili pepper were discovered in a similar way from the actions of capsaicin found in chili peppers on that system, and it too influences our interpretation of pain. But probably the one plant that has the longest history of being documented for over 6,000 years of human use happens to be cannabis. And in fact, that identified in the late 80s and early 1990s a receptor system that we all have called endocannabinoids. So the problem in all of our bodies, and it's not only in humans, it's not only in mammals, it's not only in all animals that have vertebrae called vertebrates, it's even in invertebrates, which evolved before vertebrate or animals with backbones. So this is a receptor system that goes back a 500 million years, long before cannabis ever appeared on the earth, which was about 30 to 60 million years ago. But humans and cannabis evolved together right after the last ice age. Areas off of the eastern slopes of the Himalayas in Asia are the earliest findings that's where certain plant and animal species survived. Remember, in the ice age, many things became extinct. The climate changes were just too intolerable for those plants and animals to survive. But that's how far back archaeological evidence shows that humans started interfacing with cannabis, largely initially as a textile, not as a mind-body, type of thing, the way you see it today with cannabis used for drug and mind-body to help healthy healing things. So
that's where people would have heard the term hemp.
Well, yes, hemp is the name used for the cannabis plant, generally regarded as a textile. The names hemp and marijuana are actually legal derived terms. The name marijuana is a Spanish word, technically Mary Jane, not Spanish from Spain, but Mexican Spanish. And in the 1930s, the United States used that word when it prohibited initially through something called the Marijuana Tax Act. And we've sort of languished with the politicalization of that particular plant's development for health and wellness that is getting in the way of its medicalization to date, 85 to 90 years later. So that's where, when you look at the laws that have gone across, not just in the world, but particularly the United States in the last quarter century, states are gradually not defying, but having their own self-determination apart from the federal government's designation that it is prohibited. And we have experiments going on throughout the United States, in a sense, to see just where cannabis might fit in between being one of two things, either truly having a medicinal value for health and wellness, compared to free the weed, everybody can get it in any way, shape, or form because we'll have our own self-determination, damn the torpedoes. that might be a perilous step, because the fact is that humans have manipulated that plant tremendously, particularly in the last 50 years. But
Okay.
that's what prohibition does. And the same thing happened when alcohol was prohibited in the United States in the late 1920s, or the mid 1920s. And in those days, nothing like wine or beer, which are relatively weak, were going to be risked to produce. If you're going to take a risk while something's prohibited, let's make something strong that along the supply chain can be diluted. So in alcohol prohibition, everything was about spirits, or things that were at least about 40% alcohol, or moonshine,
Moonshine.
making things as
That just came
potent,
to mind.
making things as potent as possible. And in a sort of a sense, under alcohol prohibition, we knew that happens. So cannabis prohibition, to a certain extent, may have that same, we call it here stills and hills mentality, except the hills are not Appalachia the way they were the Appalachian Mountains with moonshiners back in the 1920s, 30s, and so on. But after that, it's now perhaps the Rocky Mountains, where Colorado had popularized freeing the weed and growing things that were much more concentrated than the natural evolution of cannabis as a plant had been with human cultivation for the previous 6,000 years.
Okay. Thank you for that. On the back of that, regarding cannabis legislation now, specifically in the US, the legislation here in Europe is a bit different. And I know for a fact that, for instance, here in the Czech Republic, every grandma has her little cannabis plant growing that she makes ointments of and whatnot. So really using it for the medicinal factors. And I think in that case, they would be focusing on the CBD and not the THC. But in your work in the endocannabinoid science and botanical medicine arena, what is your goal? And do you do that as part of your venture that is called Nurturing Nature? Like, what does your workday look like when you're not hybridizing aerids?
Well, a little of it is political, some of it is educational. I try to separate out the plant and how it's doing its thing from the way the body does what it does. We've known a lot about what the plant does to people, and I'm not so sure I learned that much from studies on what cannabis does to a lab rat, for instance. There's too much information, whether cannabidiol or CBD versus THC. Those, by the way, are the principal two cannabinoids, they're called. And because they're from plants that we're referring to, we refer to them as phytocannabinoids, as compared to the endocannabinoids, which are the body's chemicals that the plant cannabis is trying to mimic. It's not the other way around.
Okay.
The body is not mimicking the plant. You have to be clear on this. The plant is mimicking some of what the body does, but the body's way of producing what endocannabinoids do is far more sophisticated and detailed and complicated, actually, than what the plant is doing. Plant's a sledgehammer, and the endocannabinoids that you and I have are little fine tools that your body is constantly using to keep your whole physiology, mind and body, in a balance with life and things consistent with life, so that when nature throws something your way that might make you sick, a disease, an injury, that's when cannabinoids, your body's own, come to play. To understand the way the body works first is kind of critically important, because it gives you then a biologic context in which you might be able to interpret better very limited evidence-based data for what cannabis as a plant might do for health and wellness. And I think that context is a really important thing to first try to understand why do people use cannabis? Some people may use it for creativity purposes. Some people may use it for pain, where they're trying to distract themselves from constantly being and thinking about that pain. It lets them get through the things they have to do. But research itself tends to be very limited here in the United States, perhaps more than elsewhere in the world where you are. Kudos, you're dealing with things that are a little more progressive than most other countries in the world. But here, because it's federally illegal, the definition means it has no known medical use. Well, we know better, but progressing on with changing that rigid way of looking at it right now from a federal viewpoint is what's getting in the way of its medicalization. Not to mention the millions and millions of people across our country and the world that have been using it, continue to use it, and most likely will continue to use it in the future. So it's, as I would say, getting real with what's going on that requires this kind of attention now, but in context with understanding what the body naturally does. And then not every body who has a very healthy endocannabinoid system is necessarily smoking pot all day. Quite the contrary. If you look at those people that you've regarded as just having it always together, whether it's their attitude, they're not getting, pain issues, aging gracefully, those things, you'll find the things that promote a healthy endocannabinoid system are things that your grandmother probably told you to do. Drink lots of good, water, eat sensibly throughout the day, get exercise outdoors, those basic things promote a healthy body and mind. And in that sense, one of the other interesting things about cannabis and endocannabinoids, it's the only receptor system that's not based on water-based chemicals. So nicotine, the capsaicin, we said, certainly endorphins, they all have extracts that are water soluble. Cannabis is coming as a lipid or a fat, an oil. And oil, of course, and water don't mix. Neither do they mix at the places in the body in nerves, which are made of lipids also, by the way, fats. By the way, that means if you're very smart and somebody calls you a fathead, it might just be a compliment. You've got a lot left. So because they're lipids, though, it's a very different system from others. And I'll say this, the most remarkable part about how this receptor system works is that the actions of endocannabinoids, all other receptor systems functions are subordinate to the controlling aspects that endocannabinoids have on them. So there's a tier level difference between this and any other receptor system. It doesn't mean it makes you that much better. It just means that that's the way the body works in terms of a hierarchy of which receptor systems are really in control. The ancients knew this, by the way, Tanya. The ancients in Asia, for instance, through acupuncture, for instance, knew that flow, or what's called qi, actually doesn't go through the mind or the heart or the lungs. It goes through the abdomen. And guess what is in the abdomen? Mostly what are called CB or cannabinoid 2 receptors. CB1 receptors are in the brain and nervous system, but health and wellness is based largely on what are called CB2 receptors in the gut. We know a lot more of that importance with the gut, something called the microbiome. And this is a way that our insides are actually in contact with the outside environment through our mouth and our digestive system. Because remember, from your mouth right through the other end is a network of bacteria and things which are actually separated from our body through that whole digestive system. That's where very helpful bacteria and other things are that our body really has to negotiate with to take in those essential things and to reject those things that are not healthy for us. So the receptor system then in ancient people for qi, flow through the abdomen, could not have realized that that's where these CB2 receptors are in fact located that determine health and wellness. And so what they really do is when you have a disease or an injury, they jump into action in order to then correct what is happening to put your body back into the balance that the disease or injury may have thrown you off balance with. That's the way we live our lives. That's the way all animals live their lives, not on it's only a molecular basis, but on a receptor controlling basis in a living entity. And so that's physiology, maybe 102, but it's based on the discovery that happens through plants. And
that is so fascinating, Dr. Block. I think we should pick up one or the other subject in a future conversation. And I hope we will have future conversations because you have so many great things to share. And I love the way you convey it to me as a layman. I do have a question about the educational side of your work. Who do you educate? I'd be interested to know.
Well, anybody who would like to listen or read. During COVID, obviously, education became more challenging because we weren't going directly to classrooms for one-on-one. But that's where platforms like we're on today, in this case, Zoom, became so popular. And it gave us time to be inside to think during those years of COVID.
Yeah.
So in fact, I'm fortunate to have authored 4 chapters in 3 real medical textbooks on this subject. And you'll be hard pressed to find real textbooks that contain that. The first was called Advanced Therapeutics in Pain Medicine. That was a direct extension from my particular training as a medical doctor and anesthesiologist. That came out in 2020 by CRC Press. Just 2 weeks ago, a book entirely about cannabis called Cannabis Chemistry and Biology Fundamentals was published. Interestingly, the editor of that book, who asked me to do the very first chapter in his book, the chapter's name is The History of Cannabis. Again, much more about the textile, but the subtitle for that chapter after The History of Cannabis is A Story of Coevolution and Human Discovery. And what's the coevolution? It's the evolution of the plant and people, because we've changed it along the way in the last 6,000 years. I mentioned maybe not so favorably in the last 50 years, because now that which is prohibited, the THC, is featured, and many of the other balances in the plant itself, the word going back to balance, nature abhors imbalances. Tanya, you know what happens in nature when there's an imbalance? Usually that which is not in balance with nature becomes extinct. I'd like to be around for a while.
That sounds very drastic. I thought you were speaking about thunder, or
that's why they say don't mess with Mother Nature.
Yeah.
So, the third book that'll be coming out in a few months is actually called Brody's Human Pharmacology. It's the 7th edition. I was asked to rewrite 2 chapters. And just to be clear for the listening audience, 1 chapter is involving cannabis as a medicine, but the other chapter deals with the realities of the use and misuse. So the 2nd chapter in that book is titled Drugs of Illicit Use and Abuse. So there are 2 chapters in the pharmacy book just to keep things fair and balanced. You know, there are ugly sides of plants, and I don't have to only refer to cannabis. Obviously, that opium poppy is the source for other man-made chemicals, including fentanyl, which is responsible for many preventable overdose deaths. It's much stronger than morphine. And so in that sense, the overall way we look at plants have to have a yin-yang, good, bad way of dealing with it. So in essence, during COVID, I was busy writing as well as doing virtual information, things like we're doing here, which is why podcasts, I think, can be so valuable. It gives me a much wider audience, and hopefully gives us a platform where in the future we can also entertain questions and answers.
Wow. So I'm still struck by the fentanyl. I always thought that was a completely chemical drug. But that's not to say I didn't listen. I did pick up that you said, you know, you can reach a wider audience. So in your work in the educational part, you don't just focus on Florida and the universities there, et cetera. You actually educate throughout the world?
I love educating out of the world. When the politics gets in the way, and Florida has its share of politics, again, I don't want to be constrained or confined to any given state. We're a world here. And with respect to whether I like it or not, the United States disposition on drugs of use and abuse, especially cannabis, is something that the United Nations Convention on how this works, the World Health Organization, things impacting the rest of the world are essentially waiting to change from the disposition that the United States offers, that I hope in the next few years it will come out of federal prohibition. And at least here in Florida, the way I look at it as a Florida licensed physician, because I'm not licensed to practice medicine in all 50 US states, but in Florida where I live and practice medicine, my license has to deal with the reality of, at this moment in time, close to 1 million Florida citizen patients who are legally accessing and using it without perhaps as much knowledge about what they're doing and using as they could have if they were better informed. So that means that with that many patients in our community, they're not simply, disappearing. They're part of the whole fabric of life here, going into hospitals, getting in accidents, sharing what their experiences are with their neighbors. And so there's an organic process that's happening throughout our country, including here in Florida, where you have millions upon millions of people who are now using it legally. And the difference with legal versus illegal use can be good because the companies making the drugs are doing so with a more regulated way that hopefully has them pure and labeled, so at least people know what they're getting. What it also does, though, is it gives kids the idea that, oh, well, if it's legal, it's probably not dangerous. And kids generally, if they start using it, especially if they use it young, and the strains out there now can impact their brain's development. Children's brains, and I'm not only saying children's, young adults' brains, don't finish making those important connections until you're close to your mid-20s as far as age. So because kids generally from teenage right through that time experiment and have a certain sense of feeling like, well, I'm invincible. It's a slippery slope with cannabis impacting how kids' brains continue to their optimal connections and performance, because those connections determine an individual's ability to problem solve later in life. So I have kids who happen to be 18 years old, and I'd like them to have all their faculties to problem solve as they venture out into the world.
Well, mine is still far away from that. And luckily my kids weren't, my older children weren't exposed. I don't believe so. I mean, what do I know, right? I'm just mom. But I think that gives us another good topic for a future talk. We're going to have to wrap this up so it doesn't get too long, which kind of makes me sad because I love speaking to you and I learned so much. I do have one more question regarding, and this is where we go all the way back to horticulture. Is there any medicinal use for Anthurium?
Well, I don't know of Anthurium in particular of having any. Perhaps indigenous peoples, from ancient times had certain ones. I've taken a fascination to them for a few reasons. Number one, compared to other aroids like, say, colocaceas and many alocaceas, the leaves are more leathery. When you have a nice mature Anthurium. Now we're talking about velvet-leafed Anthuriums compared to bird's nest Anthuriums, or those which have a separate flower that is more colorful. I'm talking about the types that at least I've given some names in the recent years, and I will comment that Anthurium Michelle happens to be named after my wife, Michelle. And another plant that came out, Anthurium Zara, is named after actually a friend's daughter who was by here one day, and I found that
And
to
my
be a
daughter.
beautiful name. And your daughter, I've since found out, is named Zara. So what a coincidence there. So the names of the Anthuriums is one thing, but I've actually been breeding and playing with Anthuriums of the kind we're talking about now for about 40 years. And it was one of those that attracted me way back because I'm fortunate to live in a community where we have people who were my role models and the people who introduced me to plants in this community, including my grandmother. But I saw some of the first ones many, many years ago. And as a more horticulture-minded person who was trying to get a healthy plant, I was able to sustain some that were rare and still have the progeny of some of those from my original accessions going back 40 years. So what happens over all of that time? When I do seeds, I'll select for which seedling has not only maybe the nicest markings, but which ones seem to be the most prolific growers, which ones coming up faster in a batch of 100 or 1,000 seedlings, which ones may be easier to grow that don't have problems culturally throughout the years. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're selecting out those that seem to have the best traits for growing. Now, essentially, that's inbreeding. And that's not good for people inbreeding because it can reveal certain diseases. But along the way, those plants that may show that they have a propensity for a certain disease, maybe they don't like too much water, too little heat stress, cold stress. Over 40 years, at least the plants that I've selected out, not only in my hands, but only in the last 2 years, since they've been popularized and found their way around the world, have I had the wonderful feedback that my plants are relatively easy to grow. And I say relatively easy to other aroids and even other velvet-leafed anthuriums. To me, that's perhaps the most satisfying part about doing it for all these years.
And
So
I have some exciting news for everybody in Europe who has been trying, like myself, like crazy to get my hands on a DocBlock original from the man himself. You shared with me this week that you have Anthurium Michelle available in your shop that would be sent from Europe. And the good thing is, the great news actually is that it's a tissue culture from one of your own plants, where you just know that it grows well and that it's robust. And so maybe here in our climate, we'll be able to grow beautiful Michelles. And I'm going to put that link in the show notes as well. And I know you weren't particularly keen on advertising on it, but I got to share it. After all,
I'll point out, I want to point out the difference that if people are not aware what a tissue culture plant represents versus a seed hybrid.
Okay.
Just the same way that if you have a mother and a father human being, if you have a mother plant, which is what we call the seed parent, because anthuriums have one flower that actually transitions from being a receptive female flower to later emitting pollen, but not at the same time. So one flower then evolves from a female receptive stage to later on, after it's receptive, to exuding the pollen that could have been used if the timing was different to pollinate itself, but can be used to pollinate another plant. So the same flower then evolves. We have a seed parent plant then, and sometimes if pollen came from another plant, called the pollen parent. When you put those two together and make seeds, those seeds bring in the properties of those parent plants and the ancestors of each of those parent plants. So the seeds themselves are not going to come out exactly alike to any other seed. That's an important understanding because people sometimes say it's not exactly like the plant in the picture. It's not supposed to be the same way that Zara, your Zara, doesn't look exactly like Zara's mother or father, some combination of the two.
She doesn't even look like her brothers.
Sometimes that could be even more beautiful than the parents. But the point here is that tissue culture is done through a different process. It's not through seeds. It's through a more laboratory-oriented process where you're selecting out. So in fact, the individual plants from tissue culture come from an individual cell. You might even think of it more like stem cells if anybody in listening has an understanding about how those can be bred to produce other things, but from a cell line. In this case, A cellular reproduction is also called a clone. It is an exact genetic equal to the parent that is giving the cells that make more of itself. So those are exact clones. And I'm happy to say that, yes, the first tissue culture plants of Michelle were released a few months ago. And right now, I know they're shown as available internationally, which is through a grower and a vendor out of the Netherlands called Casa Botanica. And they're doing very nice things with it. It is also available in the United States. And both of those can be linked through the website Nurturing Nature you mentioned, but that covers other things that I do, including things about cannabis and what I do in general. But the website, either Anthuriums by DocBlock or Botanicals by DocBlock, bring you to where those plants for tissue culture can be available today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And I really do hope that we're going to see you on here more often, because I think it's so important. Like for myself, after we came out of the pandemic, and my plant collection is full for the sheer or for the only reason that I just don't have more room. And so now what do I do with that plant passion? And there's no newness. So now I'm taking it to a knowledge level, I guess, learning more about each plant and learning where they come from, etc. And by speaking and listening to people like you, it just opens up a whole new world, and I can channel that passion for plants into actually learning so many interesting things that go far beyond anything I learned back in school when I had biology classes, right?
Well, you know what I think it does, Tanya? I think it brings us full circle to where you began today's podcast with the words nurturing nature, because we're all born with a certain nature that we have, meaning our DNA. And yet once we're born, we're dealing with how do you nurture or take care of that nature in a sense. So nurturing is what being a mom's all about, or being a parent, or what individuals, whether you're a plant or a person, needs in order to go through and deal with the consequences of life. And
Yes.
since so many of those are natural, nurturing nature always seemed to make good sense to me as a name of sort of how I like to approach not just the subject of what we're talking about now, but even what those endocannabinoids do. As we go through life, that's what's responsible for nurturing our nature.
Wow. That is a great closing quote. Dr. Block, Jeffrey, I would like to thank you so much for taking the time, not only just for this interview, but also all the preparatory time that we took. It's been super fascinating, and I look forward to a long friendship between us, Nurturing Nature and Faceplant, and the two of us over horticulture and all the beautiful things that are, for me, evolving right now around that. So thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you, Tanya. Let's do it again.